Hello everyone. Here's wishing you all a very happy and safe 2023. So today we'll be discussing the role of China in the ongoing Russia-Ukraine war. You may have often heard of catchy statements like China will be the real winner of the war, or that China will have the last laugh, etc. So, what is the truth in these statements? Or is it that the reality actually is far from it? Or is it that the cross sectional patterns of cooperation, competition, and conflict in global politics are far more complex for a binary explanation? I think a genuine answer will have shades of grey. Contrary to popular beliefs, the Russia Ukraine war has put China on a choice board that is intrinsically against its economic and global interests, primarily its economic interests. Ever since the start of the war, China's role has been under tight scrutiny, particularly by the West, and here I mean the United States. And until now, that is almost after a year of the war, the claims of a no-limits friendship between Russia and China seem to have given in to the United States' warnings to Beijing. Should it try helping Moscow evade these sanctions? This American pitch got several shades darker when Washington blacklisted 5 Chinese firms in June for allegedly providing support to Russian defense. So, in the last 11 months of the war, it is noteworthy that China hasn't violated the sanctions even once. On the contrary, pretty early on in the war, you know what China did? China set up task forces to study the various dimensions of systemic resilience to US sanctions and has been extremely cautious and passive in its support to Russia. So the question is, how far will China go to support Russia, an ally with whom it declared no-limits friendships weeks before the war started? And I'm referring to the time when President Putin visited China when Winter Olympics were happening there. So let's analyze the veracity of China-Russia alliance. In my opinion, while China will keep deepening its strategic partnership with Russia, but its policies will be low cost and risk averse, which means low risk. And those policies will be spread over a course of years to help the Kremlin survive the sanctions. Beijing's priority, however, will be to protect its own economic interests all along. Let me try and explain this better. See, if the war had ended in a few weeks, like the Russo-Georgian War of 2008 or the Russian invasion of Crimea in 2014, it would be a far simpler choice for Beijing to abide by the rules of engagement as envisioned by the Friendship Declaration between Xi Jinping and President Putin. But the sheer duration of this war, nobody really expected the war to last beyond a couple of weeks. So that duration factor and the scale of violence and the destruction in the case of Ukraine all of this has made Beijing warier of Russia's international isolation. Now, so experts disagree on the tenacity of the China-Russia alignment. Some say it has insurmountable challenges, while others say it will hold and prosper later, after the war ends. But Xi Jinping's apparent discomfort at the protracted Ukraine crisis was unmissable when the world leaders met at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit, earlier in September this year. So with whatever calculation Putin had invaded Ukraine, he did rely on the support from China. After the harsh economic sanctions, Russian firms rushed to open Chinese bank accounts, hopeful of circumventing the duress brought on by those sanctions. Beijing was expected to boost trade with Russia to cushion the stress of the sanctions. But you know what? None of that actually took off. So, China's grand plans to dominate the world order ensure junior partner Russia's survival, but not at the cost of violating sanctions or jeopardizing Beijing's mammoth trade volumes with the US and the European Union. And these two, by the way, are the two largest trading partners for China. So, it's a tussle between pragmatism and friendship. And the basic law of international politics is that there are no friends, only interests. Russia expected help from China in particularly three sectors, which is high-tech, finance, and energy. The cost of violating sanctions in the first two, that is, high-tech and finance, offset the potential benefits for Beijing because of its reliance on the West. So it's here, at these two sectors where business activity and transactions dropped drastically between China and Russia. And I'll give you some data. So according to some data, which is provided by the US Congressional Research Service, in 2021, Russia received only about 2% of the total Chinese tech exports. Now, stepping up support for Russia would mean attracting secondary sanctions, risking being cut off from the important chip suppliers in the US. That is something China cannot really afford. Just a month after the war, Chinese shipments containing, things like laptops and smartphones to Russia plunged by a 40% and a 60%. But the most dramatic fall was seen in the export of telecommunications network equipment, which plummeted by a whopping 98%, which means it literally disappeared almost, In a blow to Moscow's drone aspirations, SZDJI, which is China's leading drone producer, halted operations in Russia to reassess compliance requirements. No wonder Russia only had Iran to turn to for, those drones. About, say, a couple of months ago in November, December, Beijing actually banned the supply of military-grade processors to Russia produced by Chinese company Lungson. China's pragmatism is visible in its financial support to Russia as well. Two of China's largest state-owned banks, like the Bank of China and the Industrial and Commercial Bank of China, so these two, they stopped financing purchase of Russian commodities immediately after 24th February. After Visa, MasterCard and American Express, China's UnionPay too declined transactions with sanctioned Russian banks, and this is after the SWIFT sanctions. Furthermore, the China-led Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the AIIB, and the New Development Bank, the NDB, these two also suspended business and transactions with Russia merely days after the war started. So what does it tell us? The dominance of the dollar, the US dollar, in international financial systems may or may not be declining in the longer run, but it is potent enough for China to not risk its finances at present. Now, to the more complicated area, which is China buying Russian oil. What is behind this transaction? Moscow has often brushed off energy sanctions as being ineffective, citing access to alternative markets in China, India, and Turkey. Now, of these three, only China can really absorb more Russian energy to balance the loss of European markets. Now, this statement again is warped in various shades of grey. The twists in redirecting exports, to China is all about redirecting the volumes. So you see, after the EU-wide ban that came into effect on 5th December, Russia has had to divert a whopping 1.5 million barrels of oil every day that was earlier on its way to Europe. To divert such humongous volumes is contingent upon factors like availability of tankers, shipping insurance, pipelines, LNG facilities, and all of these are way below satisfactory markers because, these sanctions and the price caps actually include restrictions on shipping insurance companies as well. So they are actually stopped from doing businesses with Russia. Now, a factor that is not much discussed is that Russia does not have SPR or the Strategic Petroleum Reserve Facilities. The lack of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve Facilities in Russia also reduces flexibility for Russian exports. While an SPR site would enable a country to stock up crude, during supply shortage, it can also hold up the immediate surplus, so it acts like a cushion. Without a potent facility to stock up for the diverted 1.5 million barrels per day, Russia has little choice but to cut production. So, you may have noticed some news about President Putin threatening to cut oil production recently, but actually he has little choice. What does he do with so much extra oil? And now coming to China, China has been buying as much cheap Russian oil as possible to beef up its own several SPR sites. China has about 12 such sites and is developing more. But China's economic slowdown is likely to impact these trade volumes. More importantly, the ban and the price cap also give China even better leverage to negotiate more discounts, as the number of buyers have drastically fallen for Moscow since the 5th December ban came into effect. A major limitation, however, is that the Eastern Siberia Pacific Ocean pipeline, the ESPO pipeline between Russia and China, is already functioning at its optimum. And going by precedence, the other deal will also take years to stabilize operations. Coming to natural gas exports that the EU plans to start phasing out in 2023, which is this year, Russia will again be pressurized to divert exports. But here an important contrast emerges when compared with the Russian oil export situation. What is it? You see, while China's appetite for Russian oil has been really huge, the same cannot be said for Russian pipeline gas. So, the natural gas remains a small fraction of China's energy imports that are dominated by crude oil imports. The one running pipeline between Russia and China and its proposed extension, even when taken together, would carry about 26 billion cubic meters or BCM of natural gas, which is still drastically less than the 150 to 200 BCM that Russia was exporting to Europe in the years before the war started, in fact, just before the war started. So, the situation is not really very promising for Russian exports. Now, US on the other hand is tightening the sanction loopholes. See, as the war is stretching on, the Western sanction regime is also becoming more adept at identifying affiliations with a sanctioned entity that could be otherwise hidden under quasi-corporate contracts, which means, indirectly hidden contracts. China is mindful of these processes and is steering clear of getting caught in the web of secondary sanctions, especially when its economic challenges are mounting and COVID cases are soaring. You may have seen a lot of reports on how the COVID cases are soaring in China. So if there is one thing that the sanction regime has been successful at, it is testing the limits of the China-Russia alliance. China, embedded within the global supply chains and financial system, is far more vulnerable to its economic costs. Apart from maintaining trade volumes with the US, China is also keen on maintaining its relations with the European Union. And I'll tell you why. With the EU-China trade and investment deal stuck and the new Silk Road projects, which are the BRI projects, facing setbacks in the Eastern Europe, the EU has blocked China's Huawei in sensitive strategic technologies like the 5G. Obviously, Chinese priorities lie elsewhere than redeeming Russia's economic woes. So, Russia will be a diminished power after the war, there is no doubt about it, regardless of whether it wins or loses. It is likely that the junior partner might get pushed further into Beijing's lap and its exploitation. So, this dynamic will create a new set of challenges for the world and for India as well, because New Delhi is wary of a China-led Asian order. This war has upended the strategic calculus of most major players in the world, including India's. Since the war is still far from over, there remains to be much that will only be unraveled in due course. Those of you who wish to read more references on it, please refer to my opinion piece on the same. The link is provided in the description box. So while I'll be tracking that and other global developments as well, dear viewers, let me know what your take on today's video is. I'll be back soon again with another compelling issue Until then, stay tuned.